What's up, everyone? Today our Twilight Zone review marathon continues. We'll be discussing one of the creepier episodes, Night Call. As always, spoilers are ahead. Night Call is based on Richard Matheson's 1961 short story, Long Distance Call, which was originally published in Shock. This is episode 19 from season 5. Ask anyone what comes to mind when they think of the original Twilight Zone, and they'll probably mention Rod Serling, flying saucers, or the old guy from Rocky who really liked to read. However, one visual that doesn't immediately spring to mind in discussions of the classic series is that of an elderly woman in her bed. On that note, Night Call may not be the most popular Twilight Zone episode, but it does hold up just as well as any of the more celebrated episodes. Let's go to Rod Serling's opening narration to elaborate further. Miss Elva Keene lives alone on the outskirts of London Flats, a tiny rural community in Maine. Up until now, the pattern of Miss Keene's existence has been that of lying in her bed or sitting in her wheelchair, reading books, listening to a radio, eating, napping, taking medication, and waiting for something different to happen. Miss Keene doesn't know it yet, but her period of waiting has just ended, for something different is about to happen to her, has in fact already begun to happen, via two most unaccountable telephone calls in the middle of the night. Telephone calls routed directly through the Twilight Zone. So there you have it, a tight setup for a disturbing story. The lead, Elva Keene, is played by Gladys Cooper. Off the bat, two timeless campfire tropes are firmly in place. We begin with a dark and stormy night, the perfect time for our lead, Elva, to receive anonymous phone calls. During these first calls, Elva hears nothing, only faint static. Nevertheless, the haunting tone is set for what's to come. Naturally, being an elderly woman, alone and bedridden, she's immediately upset by these calls. But it's safe to say, middle of the night, dead silent phone calls would bother anyone. The strength of this episode is in its simplicity. An old woman terrorized by mysterious phone calls. Enjoy! To simplify things even further, the episode is basically a one-woman show. Elva has only a housekeeper to care for her, Margaret, as played by Nora Marlowe, and a telephone operator who she pleads with for help. Predictably, she gets little to no help from either of them. Both the housekeeper and the annoyed telephone operator pretty much write her off and explain away the mystery calls as a bad connection. So, like most Twilight Zone protagonists haunted by the unknown, Elva is totally on her own. Each call she receives is increasingly disturbing. The calls go from silence to this. And eventually, the calls turn to actual words.
No. No!
Where are you? I want to talk to you.
Leave me alone! Leave me alone!
The calls are more than enough to make the hair on your arm stand up, and the lead performance truly sells this story. Gladys Cooper plays Elva as very grounded. She's lonely, she's bored, she has moments of bitterness and impatience. However, her performance leaves the viewer sympathetic with her ordeal. Although I hate to admit it, I do find one of her more frantic moments to be unintentionally hilarious.
Over and over again. Hello, hello, hello. There.
As Elva receives call after call, you're left wondering what kind of a sick maniac would torture this poor elderly disabled woman over and over.
Over and over again. Hello, hello, hello. There.
You may be thinking, why doesn't she just ignore it? Why not disconnect the phone and let whatever ghoul or weirdo who has been calling her get bored and move on? Well, remember what was established in the opening. Elva's life up to this point was quite lonely. She was in a rut. These creepy calls are all she has. Naturally, she's fearful and obsesses over the calls. She can't just move on. Sadly, there's nothing for her to move on to. She's stuck in this nightmare to the bitter end. That brings us to our Twilight Zone twist ending. The phone company traces the calls to a downed telephone line. Wait for it. The line is from a cemetery. Elva and a housekeeper visit the cemetery and find that the line is resting on the grave of her deceased fiancé, Brian Douglas. Elva reveals that in her youth she was always very dominating. She had to have everything her way. Brian always did what she said. Sadly, Brian died a week before they were to be married. Apparently during a car ride, Elva insisted on driving. She lost control of the car and hit a tree. The accident crippled Elva and killed Brian. We do get a glimmer of hope as Elva states that now she can finally talk to Brian again, and more importantly, she won't have to be alone. But any hope of happiness doesn't last long. Later, Elva picks up the phone and calls out to Brian. He replies that she told him to leave her alone, and that he always does what she says. Then the line goes dead, leaving Elva alone and destroyed. So we get a bit of a second twist here, but it's an unfair twist. The sin of miscommunication is the only true evil force at work in this story. Let's cap things off with Serling's grim closing narration. According to the Bible, God created the heavens and the earth. It is man's prerogative and woman's to create their own particular and private hell. Case in point, Miss Elva Keene, who in every sense has made her own bed, and now must lie in it, sadder but wiser, by dint of a rather painful lesson in responsibility, transmitted from the Twilight Zone. This was another solid Twilight Zone episode which felt like an urban legend about phone calls from beyond. The episode was well directed and featured a dark, haunting atmosphere. Again, Gladys Cooper was the heart of this piece. She held it down with a strong performance. My only minor criticism is the ending feels a bit harsh. Consider this. Elva is leading a sad and lonely life. She has no one. By this point, she's already suffered for many years, mentally and physically, as a result of her part in a tragedy with her fiancé. But she's owned up to her mistakes. It feels a bit cruel to not give her a second chance. Instead, she's doomed to be alone once again. Although it had a bit of a downer ending, I still give this episode 4 out of 5 old-timey phones.
Over and over again. Hello, hello, hello. There.